Hello, testing if I'm clear and audible.
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thank you. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In opening government, we are okay with the recognition that these institutions, these people in power are born out of colonialism. But what we are not okay with under opening government is the continuous dominance of colonial determinism in the discourse on the African development. What does this narrative look like then? Three things. The first is the irredeemably in the info slide means that the African influence will always be subpar in these kinds of institutions. Secondly, the main causes of our problems are not heavily influenced by the current characterizations and the current powers inside the African Union or these African states, but the main causes are the existence of these institutions that are born out of colonialism. And thirdly, the most dominant narrative and the impact that will result out of this narrative is you have to get rid of these structures entirely rather than reform them because they are irredeemably always going to cause the problems and they will always be the ones hindering the progress and development of the African Union. Therefore, reform will probably be useless because the African influence will always be subpar and will always be dominated by the colonial influence and the colonial origin that created the structures in the first place. What does this look like then? Three things as well. The first is you are skeptic of the democratic institutions because you know that these institutions and the existence of it created the problem in the first place. But secondly, you're also skeptic of the creation of the nation states because you will argue that these borders are arbitrarily drawn and not out of the influence of the Africans. The third is even the distribution of poverty and the economic resources like land allocation, like the borders of Africa, should also be contested because it is viewed as arbitrary and an imposition of colonial powers. What is the stance coming from opening government then? We are okay with retaining all these democratic institutions, even if it originated from colonialism. Notice that opposition has to defend radically changing all these things to the point that they will remove these institutions because again, they are irredeemably the cause of all the problems and therefore any reform would probably not work on their side. But secondly, our stance is we are unhappy to support communities and ethnic ties that we will eventually have to revert to coming from opposition because you would have to revert to other powers that are not influenced by colonialism and are not born about by these institutions. The comparative, therefore, is they have to contest these democratic institutions, even if they are beneficial, because all these things, again, are irredeemably tied to all the problems that colonialism has brought about. But second, they have to defend radical change in opposition, like removing relics, for example, removing institutions, and not recognizing democratic elections and governments. The difference and on their op is, even if we do recognize where they're born out of colonialism, we will not want to radically remove them because we recognize it is beneficial to just work around the system. What is the counterfactual then, to be clear? The second is we are okay with, again, remaining these structures and work around it. And even if it is colonial in origin, we are okay with retaining and working around these structures and reforming them. An example of this is in post-apartheid Africa, we are okay with following the democratic process and electing more representatives in power. We are okay with continuously having to respect these elections, even if at times and at first it was unfair and still dominated and controlled by colonial powers. Even if there are some ethnic identities and ethnic tensions that will still exist on opening government, we still say that it is less corrupt. It's more better if these democratic institutions are there to dominate these kinds of discussions. Before that, UI.
Yeah, most of the time, the colonists didn't set up democratic structures. They used a fairly authoritarian form of indirect rule. It doesn't make sense to say that democratic structures would be the focus of your anger against colonialism on our side of the house.
No, but a lot of these democratic structures are heavily influenced by our colonial masters and the existence of it, the informal authoritative imposition. The imposition was the democratic structure, and I think this is bad if you just continuously want to revert back to the old powers that were absent before the colonial masters here. And to the extent that many of the descendants of colonial masters are still in power now, we say it is worse for the states that are under these kinds of controls if you want to forcibly remove these people in power and revert back to the more unequal society that was born about before colonial masters entered the region. Two arguments then. Firstly, why the discourse, specifically when you have colonial determination that highlights tensions within Africa, weaken development, but secondly, why it's better on opening government. So the first thing is why having colonial determinism in the discourse weakens development. There are three things that we ought to consider as true in either side. The first is to the extent that ethnic ties are arbitrarily done, and these kinds of things will exist either way. A pan-African unity under opposition is very unlikely to happen because of two key reasons. The first is inequality in power among ethnic groups because of resources, the numbers game advantage, political advantage because there are colonial masters that still favor one ethnic group over the other will still exist even in opposition. So you can't prop and fiat that a lot of the unity will happen harmoniously under opposition. To the extent that this is true, it is hard to reduce the inequality and it's hard to create a more equal Africa. The second thing is the imperfect attempts of creating democracy, of creating property laws, for example, or the introduction of rights. These are all impositions of colonialism, and these are all influenced by Western ideology that you ought to give property rights, you ought to champion democracy, you ought to champion unity. A lot of these things will have to be reversed, and a lot of these things will have to be contested when you contest that these colonial institutions are irredeemably the source of a lot of your problems. So even if you would want to work around democratic elections on their side, sure, it can happen, but a lot of people will contest it because of the discourse that these kinds of things are influenced by harmful and really bad colonial masters. This is harmful for development because of three reasons. The first is you would have to reverse a lot of the progress that has already made by delegitimizing elections, delegitimizing politicians, delegitimizing things like courts that were authoritarianly imposed in Africa. The second is it says that the state has no authority to govern. So you have to essentially have a lot of chaos first for you to have even an extent of unity under opposition. But thirdly, any attempts for peace and justice, like respecting the ICC, respecting the international community, which are all born out of colonial powers, will all be undermined under opposition, even if this is the best arbiter or best neutral person to intervene in a lot of the problems in Africa. Really quickly, why this is better in government. Two things. The first is, in terms of maturity, a lot of these things become better under opening government, even if there are tensions on our side. The first is maturing democracies often lead to more representation. Like the Philippines, for example, was initially ruled by puppet democracies, but this also led to more investments from Western institutions because they want a more stable state, therefore creating more representation. And just the logic of more elections over time also lead to more representation of very niche and ethnic values. But secondly, laws that are constructed in opposition are going to be better because each generation contributes to it. A lot of people who are minorities before often become represented. A lot of these benefits would never happen in opposition if you would radically have to advocate for the change. Even if you don't radically change it, the discourse will be harmful for development because you'd have to ignore a lot of the progress that has already been made. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Leader of Opposition.
All right, POIs in the chat, please, no verbal interruptions. And I'm going to assume I'm audible until I'm told otherwise. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the main reason that opening government is going to fall out of this debate is because they give you no actual explanation for what the likely counterfactual is on their side of the house. I think in the event that we did not have some kind of understanding of colonial determinism, you would have to concede that there would be something else that would need to be blamed for the fact that development in Africa is hard to achieve. I think if it's not the fault of colonial powers, it's more likely to be blamed on the structures that are in those nations in the status quo, on whatever their government is, or maybe on the people themselves. Great. This is going to be my rebuttal, explaining the counterfactual clashing with them. So 2 points under this. First, what it probably means what it probably means in a country itself. I think if you don't have the belief that colonialist powers are the reason that your nation is failing, it's more likely to mean that you are less likely to believe that you as a people are capable of opting into something like democracy. I think more likely this operates as some kind of hopelessness. So you're more likely to think it's endemic to your culture that your democratic institutions are failing, and it's impossible to be something for you to achieve in the long term. This is why they don't win on actually getting buy-in for democracy. democracy because it's just as negative on their side. I think populations are more likely to view democracy as just an institution of the West that has been structurally failing within their nation, and then they lose in on buy-in for that. I think at least with the idea that colonialism was the thing to blame for this, you're moving away from that over time. It's not you're not moving away from your own culture. I think people always find deterministic factors for why your country is the way it is. Like you believe it's something about how you are as a people, your situation in the world. I think what happens on their side is that people are more likely to believe we've tried democracy, it didn't work, it's just a Western thing. You lose buy-in, which means they're less likely to hold the democratic structures accountable when they happen or believe that it's something they should be trending towards. So when states do fail, just because of the fact that they don't have a history of solid infrastructure and their democratic systems are new, people say, well, okay, not much we can do about that because it's not the colonialists' fault that we don't have those infrastructures. It's just us as a people. This is always going to be worse. Yeah, I think it's very false for them to try to advance the fact that like democracy is going to be bad because it's viewed on our side as something that's okay. Yeah, I think the most important thing to realize is that democratic institutions were created after colonialism, not while it was happening. Colonialism wasn't exactly a very democratic thing. I think if you don't have the kind of buy-in, it's always going to be worse on their side. Like colonialism was hardly democratic. I don't think the democratic institutions are going to be the problem on our side as much as they are on theirs. Secondly, then for the counterfactual on the international viewpoint, I think part of the problem that you have is when Western nations don't believe that they are actually accountable for the way that African nations are suffering. They don't want to offer help. They don't want to offer aid, things like reparations. And I think secondly, when they do, it's going to be worse because they also hold the viewpoint that these nations are just it's their own fault for the fact that they're having issues with their infrastructure, meaning that they're more likely to believe they are structurally incapable of handling these kind of things. So we have to put like more stringent, I think, limitations on what we're going to be on what Western nations do in terms of aid in order to try to help them. I think opening opposition is wrong about also international buy-in for African nations themselves, like buying into international institutions. I think African nations are operating in like the UN, in the status quo. It, as a continent, has the most states in the ICC compared to any other one. I don't know why we're getting less of this on our side. I think in the status quo, African nations are actually interacting with these institutions very well. Don't think they realize this is a regrets motion. 2 points of constructive then, now that I've probably explained the likelihood of what's going on their side. I'm going to bring you how we get better international aid, and then secondly on better internal development, because I think this is going to be clashed throughout. So first then on international aid, I think the most important thing that we get on our side of the house, what we have achieved, is that the West feels some kind of responsibility for the fact that like African nations are more likely to be in disarray and experiencing things like democratic backsliding, and they like understand that they are the reason for these kind of things being bad. I think there are 3 things that happen as a result of this that are really good. First of all, you're more likely to have things like debt forgiveness for loans from the World Bank, etc., because you have European nations that know that they're the ones who are responsible for like African nations having to default on these loans, and they're more likely to be able to let that happen, meaning that you just have like more money for these nations to actually invest in their own infrastructure. Secondly, on reparations, example of this, Belgium giving reparations to the Congo. I think this is something that's more likely to happen on our side long term than it ever is on their side. This is money that's really important for development to get better for more people. I think the reason this is going to happen on our side is because the West is trending in a more progressive direction because of globalization. We have more communication, increasing awareness. As nations get richer, they're able to make their voices heard more on social media, etc. I think people in colonizing powers advocate for the government to do this, meaning we get more money going in on this way. They can't claim that on their side, even though this money is very helpful for development. Third thing then, on the IMF and the World Bank, I think again, if you can't be trusted to use money in the positive way, I think you're more likely to see things like reducing trade barriers, so like local businesses can't compete because they don't feel like they have to be responsible for those kind of things, or cutting welfare. Those are the kind of things that are going to be packaged on to loans or to like influxes of cash that go into these countries. I think this still happens on our side of the house, but on theirs it would have been way, way worse because the IMF just says, well, we have no reason to try to be a little bit more lenient with what kind of terms that we're giving you on these loans because you're just structured and capable of handling things. We have to coddle you even further than we do in the status quo. It means it's worse because these nations have just less autonomy over what they're able to do with that money when they know what to do with it better, just considering they're more clearly located within they're more situated to understand their situation. Take a POI from CG.
Why is the counterfactual people saying there is something personally wrong with me or my culture or my genes, or they are fucking dictators who are assholes like Kagame and Bahari and Mbutu, and we should probably blame them?
Yeah, I think regardless on our side of that, actually I'm going to get into this later. I think there are going to be bad leaders on either side. The fact of the matter is yours are able to still claim that like they're still able to claim the idea that like they overthrew the colonialist powers, even if they don't blame them for the way they are now. They're still likely to get some kind of buy-in for their cult of personality on your side of the house. On our side, on your side of the house, I think this is still going to be worse. Gwen will talk about that more, I think. Secondly, then on equalizing development internally, I think one of the big problems in African nations is that due to colonialism, colonialism, their economies and infrastructure are set up around resource extraction as the main kind of thing. I think the example, like the British people only needed to build roads from the mines to the ports. This is like where the result, that's like what their infrastructure looks like as a result of this. They didn't care about the movement of people to like get to jobs in cities or to have access to towns that have like food, etc., the kind of things that they need. I think what we've seen on our side of the house is that when we do have democratic institutions that were created after colonialism, we see more emphasis on needing to invest in things that immediately help people, like hospitals and schools, versus the kind of resource extraction that is what the colonists wanted. I think a counterfactual then is because these are resource-heavy areas, leaders who would be elected to democratic positions after the fact, or just installed if it's not democratic, have an excuse to enrich themselves through this method because they don't see any reason that they should be trying to undo those kind of things. I think demonizing colonial power, saying that they are responsible for the way that we are now, is better just because it meant that the infrastructure that we get was more equalized across a nation. So we see like more investment in trying to get like roads to rural areas that citizens need to have the access to. And I think this is also why Gov is going to be not able to win on better development, just because on their side of the house they have to fight the fact that there is going to be a lack of access to resources for people who clearly need it. I think also in regards to like conflict, etc., I think you're unlikely to take on the want to like go to war or to like try to create some kind of revolution unless you have really negative circumstances, just because of the fact that we've been able to have more equalized infrastructure. That's going to happen more so on their side because the infrastructure would have been worse, more people are being deprived of the things that they need. That's the motivator towards conflict. Very proud to oppose this motion.
We thank that speaker for their speech, and I'd like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, can I be heard properly?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thank you. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat, because I'm going to watch the chat for any POIs. Just give me 1 second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. In the 1500s, there was no such thing as a Filipino identity during Spanish occupation. We got colonized by America and Japan afterwards, and there was still no Filipino identity. They tried to call us Tagalogs, that we rejected that. We tried to change it because we had different identities at the same time. They forced ourselves to call each other Filipinos. They call ourselves the Philippines, and they created the Philippine government. They made us draw borders on the basis of our islands and the languages that we speak. They forced us to learn one language, such as English, and they tried to make these types of structures that would remain over time to unify our nation. They designed our cities for us over Manhattan and Chicago. They created the types of anti-colonial struggle, and they tried to allow us to unify ourselves on that basis, because in and of itself, it tried to say that anti-colonial struggle was justified, and we rationalized to ourselves that it was justified because all of these colonial structures were unjustified in and of itself, because we could give credence and we could give reputation and legitimacy to our revolutionary leaders and any other anti-colonial struggle that would pursue afterwards, because these colonial structures, by the determinism created by this narrative, says that it inherently hinders our development in many of these nations. This is what this debate is actually about. It is about how we structure development on the basis of our trust towards our institutions that are the relics of these colonial ties and these institutions. I'm going to focus on 2 specific things in this debate. Number 1, I'm going to talk about the post-colony context with respect to how we can assign blame to post-colonial leaders and revolutionary groups rather than these colonial institutions themselves and these colonial powers. And number 2, I'm going to talk about the counterfactual and try and look at all the burden stuff that OO wants and CO might want, and they're going to try and respond to it there. Number 1, on the post-colony with respect to assigning blame towards these institutions. So as much as possible, I think the framing of this debate has to be very clear. What colonial determinism does, as seen by my introduction, it makes it very, very clear that it's an us versus them narrative that is divided in terms of these colonial structures themselves. Because any anti-colonial structure that exists in the modern day state is good and legitimate because it contests inherently many colonial structures that are in and of themselves by the Infoslide irredeemable, because it causes the ethnic divisions we have right now. It causes our racial conflicts and our resource conflicts and wars with each other. It causes the warlords that fight each other in Africa because of the arbitrary borders that were created by France and many of these colonial powers. And it also assigns responsibility to many colonial powers because they themselves have to be able to pay for these damages themselves. And there is therefore no legitimacy in Africa or in the African nations and the African governments simply because on this basis, and any government that arises because of that, it becomes harmful. What are the impacts of this? Number one, to extend on what CG is going to run, it led to the rise of authoritarianism in many African nations. It allowed ourselves to trust in revolutionary governments that would continuously empower themselves, be able to become neo-colonial in and of themselves, and try and extract resources on the basis of political dynasties, trying to hijack democratic institutions, and try and say that they were legitimate on the basis of being anti-colonial, and try as much as possible to gain and use this anger and vitriol from the public to be able to try as much as possible to gain support from themselves. This in and of itself divided these peoples on the basis of those racial and ethnic ties again, because even if it had some temporary rebuke towards trying to have some unification on a revolutionary struggle, in and of themselves within these revolutionary governments were an elite class of individuals that would constantly try and assert their economic dominance by being able to take advantage of these economic resources through maybe like owning these oil rigs, maybe through owning these different pipelines, and being able to distribute these different cabinets and positions among these individuals, and trying to justify all of these on the basis that we are anti-colonial and therefore we will try and get rid of many of these anti-colonial structures. The second thing that the impact that it brings is that many of these things that opening opposition says, that it is possible to get justice or debt forgiveness or reparations for many of these harms that were caused against many of these nations, are actually revelatory of the fact that many colonial leaders and many colonial powers will always be antagonistic against any interest of the African nations and any development they can have. That is why our skepticism against the ICC within African nations and our distrust towards these courts is rooted in that colonial determinism, because many of these powers also came from those colonial structures that were imposed on our nations. That is why I still say and I still assert that many democratic institutions that we may have tried to impose post-colony, that are tried to be supported by international aid institutions or many of these other governments, are motivated by our rejection of anti-colonialism and trying to reject many of these structures at the same time. That is why, by extension, it still makes it difficult for us to pursue development policies when we continue to try and ride on that anger, ride on vitriol, ride on this anti-colonial rhetoric. That is why justice on this basis, on trying to have temporary unification among different ethnic groups, trying to go against an anti-colonial superpower before and trying to force them to pay us demands, takes us away from those institutions, but also forces ourselves to try and work and trust within our own nation states, which led to the same warlords trying to fight each other again, led to the same inequalities that were inherent in terms of natural resources with one another, and tried to have the over-reliance on many of these revolutionary groups that had power on the basis of arms, had the power on the basis of people, and the power on the basis of many of these economic and political structures and social structures and the communities that they had that were already formed because of this. Because of these reasons, it was hard to be able to do this. The division was worse. It pervaded in the long term, and it made it difficult to try and revamp and reform these institutions inherently. Oh,
Okay, you still work with international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank because you have no money if you don't. But I think that a healthy skepticism of the agenda of these institutions is good. It means that you don't allow them to control you as much and hold them to account more when they don't respect you.
all right. So by this POI, OO is already accepting our definition. So therefore, if CG tries to run a radically different thing, our definition still stands. It's still going to work. So let's just make it clear. Given this thing that you're saying that skepticism is important, I actually still bring our argument back from Maeca, that the argument of the skepticism, an overly skeptic stance that many of these African nations took led them to become overly reliant on other differing states that try to ride on this anti-colonial rhetoric, such as China and the debt trap diplomacy that is currently being undertaken in many African nations, such as many other institutions that would try and support authoritarian governments because they were legitimate in the eyes of the public, or even in some liberal sects to try and get rid of all of these structures because they say that there has to be some other unification or some redrawing of the borders that is important. Because of these reasons, it is impossible for us to rebuild Africa. It is impossible for us to try as much as possible to build any identity on the basis of nationality or citizenship or anything that we can try and get ourselves with. For all of these reasons, the divisions created by opposition are worse than the divisions that we create by colonial structures. Very proud to post.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
The last time I debated against Luigi, I complimented him for debating about America very well. I hope he will grant me that same generosity in debating about the developing world. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Note that there was no response whatsoever to what Emery defines for you as the counterfactual, because people like having narratives about why their country is the way it is. As human beings, we seek patterns, and there is a pattern throughout Africa of a lack of development and of a lack of democracy. The thing that GovBench has to defend is a counterfactual where the narrative is, rather than it being the fault of colonial structures, it is the fault, it is a problem endemic to these African cultures, that there is something different about the way that African people think, something different about their values that makes things like democracy especially more difficult, and that it is their fault, that the blame lies with them. We heard no response to this from opening government, and that will be damning for them. We did hear a response to this in the POI that we got from closing government, and their response is, oh, the counterfactual is that you blame the dictators rather than blaming colonial structures in general. Here's why this won't happen, because maybe that would happen if there was only one dictator, but you keep seeing, maybe not dictators every single time, I don't want to generalize, but you keep seeing governments that are dubiously democratic. You keep seeing corruption. You keep seeing problems with election, both over time in your own country and across the continent. You can't just blame the dictators because it's obviously more than one person who is the problem here. It's obviously more than one individual government. There has to be a reason for that pattern, and the reason for that pattern will be like the fact of like something indigenous to these African cultures. This is a narrative that is just as hopeless, and that is much more counterproductive to actually bringing us out of the state of underdevelopment, because it doesn't provide a path forward. Emery tells you that this does provide a path forward toward undoing these colonial institutions, and this is where I want to clash with opening government, because they say it is bad to undo colonial institutions because these institutions are things like democracy, and these are things like the state. So firstly, with regards to democracy, I just want to repeat what Emery said, which is that colonialism did not operate through democracy. Indirect rule, and I'll give you structural reasons for this. Indirect rule was the strategy that most of the colonizers used when they were colonizing Africa. And what that involved was taking advantage of previous power structures. These power structures themselves were almost never democratic, because upon arriving in Africa, the leaders they were interacting with almost never had control over the full area that those colonizers wanted to control. And so they needed to use anti-democratic means to keep their control there. They didn't elect these people. Moreover, colonists just didn't benefit from setting up a democracy because it caused instability for them when you don't know who is going to be your liaison to controlling the people. That means that you don't just trust institutions of democracy on their side of the house. Note that the motion is specifically about institutions set up by colonialism, not about generally Western ideas. We don't have, this motion has nothing to do with how you feel about the concept of democracy in general. And given that democracy isn't a colonial construct or institution, they don't get to say that you have a skepticism of democracy. Now, the other thing they say that I think is a little moron clash is to say that there's going to be distrust of the state and colonial borders, and that there will be reversion to ethnic identity instead. But I think this is non-comparative, because it will still be the case that the borders will still be the way they are on their side of the house, and they will and people will still not trust people of other ethnicities on this basis. There are often ethnicities who have historically had conflict with each other, and there is still seen as a zero-sum game between one ethnicity having power and the other. So this is, again, non-comparative. They don't get to solve this problem on their side of the house. And I think, like, and I think the thing to note here is that they say that this leads to more like greater reverence to the dominant political party, the one that is seen as having overthrown colonization. But note that dictatorship generally tends to rise out of instability. For example, like Thailand was never colonized, but it has still gone from one undemocratic government to another throughout the latter half of the 20th century as a result of poor economic conditions that prevented people from holding their governments to account. The leaders will just find other excuses. They will just find other reasons to say that we are the party that should be trusted. If anything, on their side of the house, it becomes easier for dictators to say democracy is unnatural to Africa. We've tried it throughout the last 50 years. It hasn't worked. We just need a strong dictator. That's the natural kind of government for Africa. And it's they can say the things that dictators always say, that we can make decisions quickly without having to worry about elections, etc. That becomes actively worse on their side of the house. They fail to solve the problem. What are the positive benefits that Emery gave you? Because I don't think they got nearly as much response as they should have. What Emery told you was that a lot of the times undoing these colonial institutions is a good thing if we're actually talking about the ones set up by colonization and not the ones just set up by, not democracy that came afterward. What we're talking about is things like the fact that infrastructure was set up for resource extraction rather than for actually making people's lives better. And so there's a lack of things like roads, for example. There's a lack of things like hospitals in rural areas because the British only needed to build roads from the port to the mine. On our side of the house, governments have an active incentive to do something about it because they are, to keep their legitimacy, they need to be seen as undoing the way that colonization set up the country to work, and this provides a very good method for them to do so. On their side of the house, corrupt governments would have no reason not to just continue to enrich themselves by continuing an economy and infrastructure set up for resource extraction. I think another really good example here is the enormous power that religious institutions hold in much of the developing world, in much of Africa, where these religious institutions spread conservative values and corrupt politics. We think it is a good thing that there is active pressure to undo these. I'm sorry, I don't have time to take a POI. So what this means is that, and I think another thing is that they say there's going to be more skepticism in working with international institutions. So what we tell you, and Emery pointed out that Africa has the most nations of any continent of the ICC. It is not the case that they don't interact with international institutions. As I suggested in my POI, they do so out of a sense of necessity, because like you need to interact with the World Bank and the IMF in order to have a budget. You'll be broke otherwise. And the ICC, like people do find collective benefits in being part of the ICC. What happens on our side of the house, however, is that there is more accountability because it's good to have a healthy skepticism of these institutions. In a world where you think it is just your fault and it doesn't come from the colonizers, we think that these institutions are going to be less democratic. You get more buy-in for things like the IMF saying we will only give you a bailout if you do what we say and you run the government like we tell you to, because you can't be trusted to do it yourself. Yes, that happens to some extent on our side of the house, but it would have been much worse on theirs. We've seen a decline of it in recent years. They never would have. And we also think that, and they say, oh, China seems comparatively better. Yes, but China seems comparatively better because they don't have bad conditions on their loans. We've explained why World Bank and IMF conditions would get worse, meaning that you don't get that reversion to China. Finally, we think that we get more political will for things like reparations. We get more political will for debt forgiveness. We think that this is incredibly important in supporting the economies of these nations. For all of these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome the member of government.
Before I start, just to check, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. Panel, it is entirely possible to critique colonialism and colonial structures without necessarily saying that our destiny and our history has always been determined by them. That's why we can quite literally say that the World Bank, for instance, and its structural adjustment policies are shit for us. We don't necessarily need to marry ourselves to a model where we literally don't critique these sorts of things at all. And by the way, this sort of stuff has been happening already, right? India, for instance, does this already. India doesn't say, oh, we were always defined by colonialism and our development trajectory is going to be defined by colonialism. They recognize that colonialism was a horrible evil that was inflicted upon them, but they still work with colonial powers. They still realize that local actors have agency and it is important to accord blame, etc., to them. So that's not the comparison. I want to note one point of framing before I move on to the substantive part of my speech. Nobody's talked in this debate about who controls the narrative about what colonial determinism looks like. So I'm going to first of all start by that. I would note that oftentimes leaders at the top, people like fucking Mugabe, are the ones who are controlling what colonial determinism is and how people interact with this sort of narrative. Why is this true? Because one, these people are oftentimes colonial allies. This means that they oftentimes got lots of financial capital because of colonial patronage. They own media houses. They win elections because they have more money. They decide what the education syllabus is going to look like. And obviously, they also have incentives to stay in power. So they're obviously always forward narratives, which mean less opposition to them. The second thing I want to note is in terms of making this narrative, the memories of colonialism in Africa are really fresh. Like it was literally a generation ago where colonialism and its evils were inflicted upon these people, or maybe their kids at the very least remember this. So there's lots of buy-in when you claim that the reason why we haven't developed is because of colonial powers, not because we've been fucking up for the past 50 years. The second thing I want to note is the counterfactual, which I do think OG misses. And I'm going to give you a simple reason for why we're going to blame Mugabe as opposed to ourselves and our own culture. There are endemic problems within Africa, such as poverty, entrenched violence, and so on and so forth. These leaders are supposed to be very unpopular because they are not controlling the scope of these problems, which is why you will, one, probably accord blame to them. But the second thing I want to note is, given that the vast majority of people are poor, have no access to political power, why the fuck would they blame themselves and their culture, given that they're literally not controlling outcomes and not controlling the destinies of their lives? So they're likely to blame the most powerful actors, which are going to be these kinds of dictators. The last thing I want to note just with regards to engagement is this idea of reparations is just out. Like, I'm sorry you've been asking for reparations for the past 60 years. When have you gotten it? I'm not sure why they haven't mechanized this at all. Three things in my speech then. Firstly, why this encourages complacency and a lack of accountability. Two, why we don't get international cooperation the way that we should. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about colonial transitions and minorities. Let's talk about complacency and accountability. I want to note that oftentimes African states become one-party states or dictatorships. There are four reasons for this, which I don't think OG mechanizes. One, very simply, you have the discursive element of saying they did it, we did not. But two, and more than what OG says, one, when you say everything has been determined by colonialism and we're fucked by colonialism, notice this is a process that's been going on for centuries. So necessarily reversing the process also requires lots of time. So you always keep on saying to your population, we need more time to do this. That's why this is not working. Just have some faith in us. But thirdly, you oftentimes also say, we fought the colonial powers out. So therefore, if they were so bad, you must require us. That's why they oftentimes become one-party states. Thirdly, I also want to say that your liberal opponents also buy this colonial deterministic narrative. Like the Marxists within South Africa, for instance, will obviously not reject the idea that colonial determinism is a thing and it obviously determined your identity, which means that they also don't have the discursive element to fight you. The last thing I want to note is your external accountability also goes away. At the point at which lots of African states combine, coalesce, and unite and say, fuck the ICC, none of us committed war crimes, we don't need to marry ourselves to this colonial structure, it becomes very difficult to remove these people from external processes. Why is this then bad? In terms of one, representation goes down the drain, like minorities, etc., never get represented in these governments because they're one-party states. Two, I would note that this leads to very bad policy outcomes. So one, note that in the 1960s, when you took out the colonial powers, you oftentimes said their policies were bad. What happened then? Agricultural subsidies were taken away from the agriculture sector because you said, oh, wait, they are buying our cheap goods for like, cheap prices, etc. We're not ever going to develop like this. We must manufacture, and therefore you remove your subsidies, put into the manufacturing sector, not realizing that you had developed a comparative advantage within this sector and they had developed a comparative advantage within manufacturing. What happened then, panel? It led to fucking famines in Africa where farmers literally committed suicide because they didn't have the money to buy their products, sell their products, so on and so forth. The second thing I want to note is white people in certain African countries are still important economically speaking. Look at Zimbabwe, for instance, where white people control the vast majority of land and own that sort of land. When you start off by saying white people screw us over, one, these people obviously feel unsafe, but it also leads to policies such as Zimbabwe saying, oh, we're going to take away the land from these people and redistribute it to the black population. What happens then? Capital fucking flight, because these people feel unsafe, they don't have economic opportunities. And I would know that this is a huge problem in terms of development for these countries, because they need this capital, they need their knowledge, their supply chain, so on and so forth. In terms of impacts, complacency and accountability are obviously important and it's bad. Let's move on to international cooperation. I would note that you remove incentives to cooperate because you're obviously abusing the people who are meant to cooperate with you. But there are two cases over here that we need to analyze. One, the white savior complex attack actually manifests itself in really bad ways. NGOs, etc., for instance, like Doctors Without Borders, etc., are always wary of oh, should we go into this country? Because if we do, we're going to look like the white colonizer coming back again. And this, by the way, assumes the best incentives for liberal states on opposition side where they actually do want to help. But they are hindered because they feel like this is going to be a very legitimate attack on them. The second thing I want to note is lots of colonizers still have bad incentives. So this looks like, going into Africa, doing military interventions or giving really bad structural adjustment programs and aid policies which perpetuate dependency. But now what do they have? They can literally say that, look, we're trying to help Africa. We screwed them over. We've fucked their future prospects and so on and so forth. So you disguise your bad incentives by saying we're trying to help them. And this obviously leads to very poor outcomes for these countries. On the comparative, by the way, we solve this problem much better because if corrupt leaders are attacked, notice aid agencies obviously don't give money or tie lots of structural adjustment programs to their aid. To the aid that they give because they're wary of processes such as corrupt leaders taking away the money and their money not being beneficial. At the point at which you attack them, I think they're more likely to give you aid. The third thing then, colonial transitions and minorities. Two things over here. One, atrocities happened when colonial transitions happened. This is because ethnic and religious cleavages were really important at that time. This looks like Muslims killing Sikhs when shit happened, or like Hutus and Tutsis murdering each other at the point at which these powers leave. There is no redress for these minorities in the status quo. The only way in which these minorities are recognized and the atrocities against them, the literal fucking war crimes against them are recognized if you get out of power structures, you get out of like dictatorships, etc., that literally ruin their lives, and you give them the possibility of electing someone new. For the sake of democracy, for the sake of African development, we are very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Member of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the mistake every single other team in this debate makes is the assumption that the states in Africa give a shit about whether their people like colonialism or not. What I will tell you is that most of these states operate on entirely pragmatic self-interest, and they are led usually by one person who has power over his people just because he has the power to rig elections and the military and things like this. And two, like holding them accountable is almost always impossible, regardless of what, like, do you blame them for the problems happening or not? And finally, thirdly, I'll explain that there are a bunch of auxiliary benefits to both this narrative existing in the West and in Africa. But firstly, why is like, basically, why will there always be, how do you call them, dictators in Africa? I think you can accept that people will think the institutions set up by the West are good, or you can accept they think these institutions set up by the West are bad. But on both sides of the house, I think we can agree that those institutions are pathetically weak politically, because made them contingent on themselves, right? Most of the states that were set up while the West was still there and while it was colonizing were meant to be contingent on countries like England or like the Dutch and things like this. What this essentially means is after colonialism stops, those states become very vulnerable to things like a military leader with like self-interest incentives to just take control of the military and take control of that state, right? To an extent, I think what the people think is like not as relevant when most of that change is driven by other actors and things like this. But the second thing is, I think that there are Western incentives for like corrupt governments and for dictatorships, right? Like Western mining companies who want to do inhumane shit there will like pay off the people, the politicians who do these things, right? In order to give them permits everywhere. Arms dealers who want wars to be happening there will support dictators who are likely to create these kinds of conflicts and things like this. So irrelevant of what these people might think, there are very strong actors which like drive this change to happen. But then why can't we keep these people accountable once they get in power? Because they control the military, right? It doesn't matter how popular you are. It doesn't matter how, like, whether your people blame you or not, which is what kind of, to an extent, CG ran. When you have money from these kind of Western actors to pay off your military, and when your people are dirt fucking poor, they don't have money for food, let alone to think about things like freedom and things like this, you are very likely to keep power, right? Notice that the only way these kinds of changes happen, the only way that, like, how do you call them? The only way the dictators are change power is when they run out of money to pay the military, right? This is broadly how it happens in the world. This is unlikely to happen on either side of the house. But finally, on the international aid point, that you are likely to have things like skepticism, and you are likely to get more international aid. I think on the corruption related to international aid, I proved why corruption will be there symmetrically. But on the skepticism, which I think to an extent all proved did not prove why these countries have like the agency to manifest their skepticism. Basically, if they are skeptic of the IMF, why do they have bargaining power to determine what kind of policies the IMF gives them? But finally, on broadly this point about aid, notice these countries will symmetrically do what they do because they don't give a shit about what their people think, right? Their people might think that taking money from the West is bad, but you're a dictator with pragmatic interests who wants to get richer at a point where more money comes into your state, so you're likely to take this on either side of the house. Then what are the benefits when you blame the West for the things that are happening currently? One, I think your people broadly feel better in Africa, right? For two reasons. One, they do not blame themselves or something inherent in themselves, which is if we accept Orwell's characterization of the counterfactual, right? At the point where you can blame an arbitrary, like scary thing like the West for a lot of the structural problems that you face, these problems you are likely to never overcome, these people are structurally poor and things like this, you are less likely to feel shitty, or a lot less likely to feel as if you could have done more and things like this, and you are a lot more likely to recognize the true impact of the other people. But secondly, why is it bad to blame your own state? I think we can accept that you are unlikely to change your state, but this means things like, one, having less trust in the state, which just makes you feel bad. You feel as if when like a big problematic thing happens, like a hurricane or something, your state won't be there to protect you and things like this, which just makes you feel bad on an everyday basis. But two, you are less likely to interact with your state, right? You are less likely to be involved in state processes and things like this, which granted aren't perfect because your state is shit, but they are something, right? They are more than you would get if you did not interact with the state at all. Second piece of extension, why this is likely to make ethnic conflicts there happen less. Notice ethnic conflicts and the existence of ethnic conflicts are likely to be blamed to the West on our side of the house. Why? Because they are likely to recognize the things the West did to create these ethnic conflicts. Things like drawing arbitrary borders to put people who don't like each other together, right? Things like giving them different rights so they grow to hate each other more and things like this. At a point where you don't hate the West, at a point where you don't blame them for this racial conflict, it is substantially less likely that this racial conflict will ever end, because you believe, one, it is something inherent in your people to fight and things like this, so it means that you are not likely to think that you have a choice in this matter, and two, you are more likely to think that you have a positive incentive out of this, right? When you think that the West created it, you are much more likely to be like, maybe the West just wants us to fight to be weak and things like this, right? Holding an external actor accountable means that it is much more likely that you realize how pointless these conflicts are and how like futile they are for a great many ethnic people. Yes, OG, quickly, please.
Yeah, so post-colonial states are vulnerable to elite neo-colonial rule that encourages this ethnic conflict when they rely on vitriol and anti-colonial rhetoric. It is only possible to contest this when we separate blame towards colonial institutions and powers from other forms of identity.
Yeah, cool. I think I proved like corrupt governments will happen regardless, and like dictators who use these, and also ethnic conflicts happen regardless. Like it is the colonials that incite this ethnic conflict. They want separation. They want these people to not be united because they did not want them to like rebel and things like this at a point where they had invaded them colonially, right? I think to an extent this is likely to be symmetrical. But finally, on why African people would be treated better in the West, like if they were to emigrate or something like this. One, I think to an extent the West feels guilt. This guilt doesn't always manifest in like international aid and things like this, but it could manifest in the way you treat someone else, right? It could manifest in you recognizing your own fault in this person's situation. And two, you are more likely to forgive how bad, like for example, how they don't know much English or something like this, because you recognize your own fault in the problems in their country and things like this. What this impact is, one, they will be treated better if they were to emigrate to the West, but also things like more universities might hire like African people at a point where they recognize their own fault in what is currently happening there, and the point where they recognize their own like how do you call them, structural problems they have caused in these other countries. This is just likely to manifest as an auxiliary impact. Overall, I think we give the most realistic characterizations of African states. Vote us.
We thank that speaker for his speech. I now like to welcome the government whip.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you.
The most persistent tragedy in African development is that those in power have always had someone else to blame. We said that the point at which you do not have a straw target, the colonial other, the white colonial savior, is the point at which you're likely to create narratives of development. The flip side was complacency. The flip side was using this propaganda to further anti Western aggression, which does not put food on the table, but only serves to further divides between the West and African states. Secondly, we said this creates a huge problem and quandary for international actors. For instance, if you're having discussions within the World Bank, there are now legitimate concerns of being internationally cancelled for being a white savior going into these African states. Because the point at which there are images of white people handing out food packages to poor Sudanese farmers, you are likely to feed into the narrative that you are still the colonial other. Hence, less help is given. But then the second case is arguably even more terrifying. They are states with bad incentives, unlike the first case, and these states use every single sentence uttered by opposition bench as moral legitimacy for horrific interventions within African states for the last 70 years. Read the French intervention in Mali, read the persistent economic intervention of the IMF and the World Bank, that these states do need help. These states will always need help because they have not moved on from their colonial legacy. But then the final thing that we said was some people have had the terrible prospect of never being part of this narrative of development. Because what has happened is that whenever a colonial transition happens, the poorest people among us are the people who face mass rapes, genocides, internal displacement. These people are systematically locked out of the narrative of development. And these people are never talked about because you can always talk about the majority groups in these countries and the colonial other and keep blaming it on them, forgetting the fact that these majorities were the ones inflicting these atrocities during the transition in the first place. Three really key aspects of development within the continent that Taha talked about that basically received very little engagement. There was implicit engagement at closing opposition extension. I'm going to deal with it. The first thing is about authoritarian drift. A couple of things I want to say here. First is a sort of temporal problem with this analysis because it assumes that we're taking up this narrative in 2020, not 1968. So presumably dictators were less powerful then, people could have mobilized then. So there's lots of reasons to believe why dictators wouldn't have entrenched this power to the point at which they're entrenching it right now. The second thing to point out here is that this completely misses the analysis of how this creates a unifying platform for people who are ethnically, linguistically disparate, but have the common lived experience of living under a government which does not know how to govern. These are people who would have likely united on a multi-ethnic, multicultural platform to hold the government to account, re-Lebanon, re-India, re a bunch of post-colonial states. The third thing that I want to point out is that apathy won't exist in our world. If anything, and I want you to just, I'm sorry I'm intuition pumping this, but this seemed a bit strange to me. They're basically saying the government is fucking us and we don't have money to food to put on the table. I'm going to be apathetic from now on. This apathy bullshit works in England. It doesn't work when you don't have fucking food, right? Because the difference between being apathetic and not being apathetic is the difference between you starving and not starving. Take those arguments somewhere else. But then the final thing that I want to point out is this thing about inspiration and motivation. They said, it feels good in your belly, the point at which you can blame someone else for your problems. One, there isn't food in your belly, which I've already talked about. But what about that inspiration in your belly? I think that inspiration in your belly comes from the agency of knowing that you can change these things because there's a fundamental haplessness and helplessness which colors not just closing opposition's extension material, but also opposition benches material more broadly. The point at which we do say that yes, the colonial tragedy was indeed one of the worst things that happened in our history, but we have the agency to change this, that this is a past dependency that we can break, that this is a critical juncture in our history where we can do something better and be something better is when you're much more likely to be inspired. What were the problems with opening government? I'll take you in a bit, Gwen. The first problem with opening government was that it's strange that the entire case was premised on democracy. It's unclear to me why democracy is instrumentally good towards development. Like, it might just be the case that, like, you don't have to be democratic to have development, or you could have to be democratic to have development. So it's unclear to me why democracy promotion is the end-all normative and instrumental value on opening government. The second problem is that they miss that the most important actors here are actors which are at the top of these power hierarchies. These are people like Mbutu, people like Buhari, Kagame, Mugabe, all of these people. And the sort of legitimizing potential that the narrative that opposition bench espouses gives them. Finally, they miss the most vulnerable actors within this debate. We will show to you the point at which you have mass complacencies when people who are minorities are systematically locked out of narratives of development. Hence, on the analytical way up, we're winning against them. I'm going to deal with opening opposition. Before that, I'm going to afford them a chance to engage. Please go ahead.
There's only one political party that overthrew colonialism and they grow more distant with time. But when the narrative is that there's something endemic about African culture that means democracy doesn't work, every dictator can take advantage of that. And it doesn't matter if you personally couldn't do anything about it, it's the whole culture that they blame is the problem.
One, nice to see you again, Gwen. But secondly, I think the problem with that argument is that you're assuming that people blame intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic reasons. Again, like, why do people have like internalized racism, right? Why do they say the problem is in me, the problem is in my culture, and not the literal reality of Kagame taking a private jet for a holiday in Cape Town and this person starving? Like, it's unclear to me why that intuition pump doesn't work, right? It's a lived experience of all of these people. Two claims on opening opposition. Firstly, international aid. Firstly, this engages with a lot of our stuff about, either you don't give aid because you're a white savior, or you try to help too much because it perpetuates dependency. So there needs to be a response there. But secondly, does international aid really matter? Because international aid is only valuable insofar as you have people in these states willing to use it appropriately. We've shown to you that if you have a mass complacency within these governments, and it's unlikely that no matter how much aid you have, it's unlikely to be used well. The second claim that they had was about internal development. A few responses here. The first is the glib response. The only example they could think of in terms of reparations was the Congo. I do think that was more to do with the fact that they killed 12 million people and less to do with the fact that colonial determinism was a thing, but fair enough. Secondly, I just think you change the incentives on our side, the point at which governance structures are much more likely to think in a bottom-up sense in terms of enacting change, as opposed to a top-down, we need the IMF sense. But the final thing that I want to point out is to do with identity, right? And it's really important to understand that these people have faced mass trauma from colonialism. Consistently using this as political rhetoric to justify your incompetence is not just a strategically terrible thing to do, it's utterly inhumane. And for those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome the opposition whip.
Hi, I presume I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Just a second then. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. I think when we were the first team to actually characterize what those leaders look like and how change supposedly in this debate would happen, I think we win on two metrics. One, we just proved to you that change is probably influenced by many other institutions and lobby powers and all of those. So therefore, it's really hard for either side to claim, oh, we have this big change. But two, I think we bring 3 points of extension that utterly outweigh all of those. Let's just go firstly through OG's case, right? Basically, they take this huge burden on themselves to prove why, one, like they would have this huge change of like democracy and all of those, and two, they take other things such as the less ethnic division, like less wars, all of those, and just other things afterwards. Firstly, about ethnic division, I think there are 3 responses to this. One, there's just ethnic divisions happening at the worst case of theirs is symmetrical. Why? One, there's just immutable differences about both groups that probably would cause conflicts, right? Different religions and just alienation because of them. Two, just history. No matter if there was colonialism or not, they probably had interactions. This would mean that the past of their suffering is probably something that will keep them today to believe, this group did this to me and my family and my heritage. 3, I think there just will be always parties who will benefit from the alienation of both groups, such as like not only leaders, but both leaders of countries actually, without even colonialism, but even if from the past. So, but on the best case in our scenario, we just prove why, even if this is true, why we make it better on our side, right? Like our like extension basically says, when you have someone else to blame, you have other reasons to rationalize why something has happened in before. This would mean that one, you're more able to resolve such conflicts at the moment at which you're not to blame the other group for something happening or just to focus on that. But two, when you have someone else to blame, it becomes less violent. So on that clash point, I think we win to this point. Two, they just say West has bad incentives to like mess up with Africa, and therefore it's bad. I think there again, there's symmetry here, right? Because one, there will always be Western countries that care about morality that will probably help Africa, right? No matter if both when they were like colonized because they feel guilt, or both. I think on the symmetry again on the other side, if they say they will never help, I think there's just the incentives that we get to just West benefits from Africa, right? Like one, resource is two, cheap labor, three is just cheaper to manufacture there, right? So you always have like things to do there as well. But lastly, it would probably always be involved in the policies there, right? Like corruption and just investing in such things. So generally, then lastly, what I think they say is basically changing institutions, right? Like democratic institutions. I think it's likely that those institutions would to be changed on both sides of the house. I think that the asymmetry here is that you cannot hold those leaders accountable for the extension of points that we give, right? And notice how our rebuttal and our mitigation that we bring only beats the OJ case with like without OOs, right? Because OO never do respond essentially why the change is something like unlikely to happen, but even if it's to why it's more likely on their side. So on that point, I think we beat them on their side. Then let's move on to our openings, right? Because they bring again some arguments, which is basically West is more likely to help to like give reparations, international aid, and all those, which are generally good for the economy. And then like internal conflicts, which I think they spend a little too less time to be an important clash in their case. What I think is more important in this is to one, once we bring in the analysis, which is will the West help no matter what, or two, will they have like harmful impacts on like those countries no matter what because of the incentives that they have. I think this not disproves but just mitigates the case of the opposition, right? Because at the point that both CG and OG give responses to them, they don't respond to the model at which like maybe like international aid something symmetrical. Then I think what's important in this debate is this: we may prove like change on three different levels, which is on the people, right? Which is like one, blame; two, generally internal conflicts; and three, in general like what would happen to the people in the state. I think this is more important on two metrics. One, I think it's more probable, right? Proving that a feeling in someone exists is something of a less burden to prove that, international aid would happen. Or two, I think it's just intuitively more reaches the impacts, right? Even if money is received by the West, why would this trickle down to the people, right? Why would this trickle down into the economy? I'm not bringing analysis over this. We prove that the feeling of people in general is something important. And why is this so? One, people in those countries probably have bad lives on both sides of the house, right? I think in the point in which we're able to mitigate this grief just a little bit, or to not add more aggregation towards it, I think is something that we should value in this debate. But two, I think on the metric of where we help more people, I think we beat them on this point, as it is easier to prove that those people probably like who have some like pride and all of those. I will take you in a second, CG. Generally have those interests. And then let's move on to CG, right? Because I think the extension that they bring is basically one, accountability, and the response that they give to our cases. You could have done this when leaders were like less stable, weren't strong enough. I think there are three rebuttals to this. One, notice that for even if this was at the start when they overthrew colonialism, I think those leaders were already strong enough, right? One, they had a lot of connections in order to get to power. Two, they had a lot of resources in order to be able to set up, like just get the power from whoever was beforehand. And three, I think they had some image of the people and all of those. So which I think even if they say, if it was the 1950s, it could have been better, so accountability could have happened. But two, I think the framing that they do agree as well is just basically people on the house, on both sides of the house, have things to worry about, such as food and all of those. So why would they like bother to overthrow people? I think the general rebuttal here is people cannot have drive change in those countries, right? They don't have the power, they don't have the ability to do so, as they have other things to think. So I'm not exactly sure why this is something that is good, not going to continue at the same way, right? Like they basically say you could have this and you can have accountability because you don't have this us versus them narrative. But I think think there are other things. One, you can have us versus them narratives, even when you're not under colonization, right? Like if you have just nationalistic interest, you probably could have this narrative. Two, I think when they say you need us in order to like get after colonialism and all of those, I think it's even if this is not something that would happen, I think this is not less improving to the point that probably the same people that were coming without this narrative would still come to power, right? So and generally I think we would have this symmetry. So why do we win this debate upon this point? One, we prove why change is not like driven by people. Two, I think we prove why corrupt governments can not be overthrown because of the military, because of the influence that they have, the welfare that they have, the control over like money and the bribes that they get from Western countries. And at the point of that, we prove that true change is really hard to happen. Then we compare it to our extension, which is people feeling good would be prioritized because they're the ones that suffer. So we want them to be better. No team has proven otherwise that they're better for us.
You're muted.
You're muted right now. Can't hear you.
Oops, my bad. Yeah, please call speakers and observers leave the breakout room. Thank you everyone for that debate. Judges will stay here, and good luck.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone for the round.
Thanks, everyone.